Hello, my name is Julia Korkman. I'm a senior program officer at HEUNI and an adjunct professor and professor of practice at Åbo Academy University. And in this lecture, we talk about how we should interview children when they are suspects in criminal proceedings. This topic is important. It has, among other things, been noted in the so-called Mendes principles. And there it says that some individuals are particularly vulnerable to suggestive questioning. An interviewee's personal characteristics, such as age, psychosocial, or intellectual disabilities, can increase the risk of unreliable information or even false confessions by making them more suggestible and affected by interrogative pressure, trickery, and deceit. Archival analysis of false confessions have repeatedly demonstrated that juveniles and interviewees with psychosocial or intellectual disabilities are prevalent among false confessors. So we know that young age is associated to suggestibility, also to slightly less developed decision-making in terms of what happens if I now say something that isn't true, or if I say confess to something. We also know that traits such as ADHD are likewise associated to, for instance, difficulties in managing a kind of decision-making situation in which you have to assess long-term outcomes of your behavior. We also know that substance abuse issues are increasing this. So for some of the youth we are dealing with in criminal justice processes, they have multiple layers of this kind of added vulnerability. This implies that they should be interviewed by someone who is aware of how to deal with persons in vulnerable situations. Youth in itself implies that adolescents are much more likely than other age groups to come in some kind of conflict with the law. If you talk about age as kind of or over the lifespan of a person, we know there's something called the age crime curve, showing that in each generation or in each cohort of living persons, youth is the time when people are most likely to be crossing some borders or making some criminal acts or breaking some rules. And for the absolute majority of human beings, this kind of risky behavior declines after they become young adults. So here you can see it's around 18, 19, something like that. This kind of increased risk may start as early as 12, 13, but increases then with some years and then slowly starts decreasing for the most part of human beings. Police officers who work with child suspects, with adolescents, with teenagers who conduct who misbehave or do some crimes, are quite aware typically that in the most of these cases, this teenager might do some transgression, they get caught, you have a severe discussion, and you are likely not to see that young person again, or it is not necessarily an indicator of someone who is very deep down in criminality. But then there is a small group of adolescents who actually are on a much worse road, who do offend repeatedly and sometimes with very serious criminality. And that is the group we really need to focus on, of course. So it's important to understand that committing some transgression in youth is quite typical behavior. We don't need to blame or to sort of... We don't need to think that all of these are on the path towards serious criminality. So this understanding is crucial to also to allocate the resources in the right places. Adolescence is a time of very dramatic change, and everyone who has adolescents in their vicinity knows this. And now I'm particularly talking about puberty, children in the age of puberty. When we talk about children, youth, adolescents, it's a bit tricky because recent research has actually assessed that adolescence continues until the age of 32, which typically is, well, it's not really the group that I'm referring to now, but maybe teenagers and very young adults is the core group when we talk about this increased risk of criminality. And now when talking about children as suspects, I am referring to children under the age of 18, as stated by the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And in the European context, the age of criminal responsibility varies quite a bit between countries, somewhere from 10 to even 16 at least. So countries have different policy and legal approaches to this group. But persons under the age of 18 are now children in this presentation. It's also, however, important to separate these adolescent children, teenage children, from very young children. And in fact, this is important to note in this context because most of the research on child interviews has been conducted on young children, typically pre-puberty children, in the context where they are suspected of having been victims of crimes or witnesses of crimes. There's comparatively much less research on children who are suspected of having committed crimes. And there's also much less research on teenagers, on adolescents. We know, however, that this is a time of dramatic change. Puberty, of course, sets hormones afire, and this activates, for instance, strong drives for high-intensity, thrilling experiences. There's a strong reward or there's a reward sensitivity. So these young people are maybe quite impulsive and risk-taking, and this may also increase the risk of delinquent acts. Puberty sharpens motivation to gain social status and impress peers. We know that in a typically developing child, the focus in puberty changes from the immediate family to the group of peers, and that is kind of really the important group then. This also means that children or youth, for example, teenagers who make decisions on their own are typically much more balanced in their decision making than when they take decisions in groups. So, which we can see, for instance, from, I think this is a tragic truth throughout Europe, that you have cases where a group of teenagers have had a terrifying car accident because the driving behavior was too risky. And there are laboratory studies suggesting that if children are, for instance, driving on their own, they are not taking the same risks. So, which is quite normal if you think of it. But this is an important driver to understand children's behavior also in terms of the delinquency. And this drive may lead to involvement in gang activities, in bullying or in group offending. It's so important to be part of the group and to do as the group wants. It's a kind of suggestibility, but slightly different from what younger children have in relation to adults. We also know that when teenagers act, when they make decisions that are just related to information, like cold cognition, as we say, that decision-making develops quite steadily and nicely. But when decisions are related to emotions, that's the part of decision-making that really is struggling in puberty. It certainly is the case for human beings in general that we are worse at taking good decisions when we are very angry or when we're madly in love. I think everyone knows that. But for adolescents, this is even more so. So in the research, it's stated that hot cognition is like outpacing cold cognition. So, and this is really a key of criminal vulnerability. Again, this is the crime age curve, and it's been known for a very long time to be the case. I think throughout centuries, probably millennia, people have been worried about the youth of today who do not behave as they think they should be doing. It's really part of human development to be in some kind of opposition to previous generations, or to try something new, or to break rules if you don't think they are good enough. And this has been considered as a quite healthy aspect of youth development. If a young person just accepts everything previous generations are saying, then we might be, should be perhaps a bit worried. I've even found this quote that is maybe taking it a bit far, saying that risk-taking behavior characterizes normal adolescent development. This is true, of course, but some experimentation, be it with drugs or sex or diets or new ideas, is typical and may even be an essential component of a healthful adolescent experience and contribute to optimal competency. I don't think many developmental psychologists would encourage youth to try drugs, but it is clear still in research that this is in itself true, that this experimentation is part of normal development in youth. However, it may lead to very problematic situations, particularly if these children have vulnerability factors in their own background. And one of the issues that are now being talked about very much throughout Europe is the recruitment of children into criminal activities by organized criminal gangs. This has been particularly much talked about in Sweden, leading also to the lowering of the age of criminal responsibility from 15 to 13. Which has been something the Committee on the Rights of the Child has been strongly opposed to. So child rights advocates, and in the case of Sweden, actually all professional groups have been very much opposing this legal change, because they do not find that it is helpful for actually protecting children from being involved in criminal activities. We know that criminal networks can actually quite well also pinpoint the children who are in vulnerable situations, for instance, who are lonely or who have problems in their family. It's not to say that all children who become involved in criminal activities would have some kind of vulnerability factors, but it's very likely that the large majority has. And there are some findings that criminal gangs actually focus on children who they see are kind of in a risk zone. So these are children whose society has not been able to protect and whose development they have not been able to support in the right direction. There is a study on the effects of lowering the age of criminal responsibility conducted in Denmark, where actually there was a period in which kind of a trial where they lowered the age of criminal responsibility from 15 to 14 for 20 months, and then followed up the effects of this, noting that actually it did not increase or decrease the criminal activities among 14-year-olds. Quite the opposite. It even actually increased the criminal activities to some extent. So this would suggest that lowering the age of criminal responsibility does not seem to protect children from this kind of involvement or make society any safer. But this is something that is discussed currently around Europe. There seems to be suggestions of lowering the age of criminal responsibility, thinking that if the children would know that there might be sanctions, they would not commit the crimes. So far, no evidence is actually supporting this idea. So I point to this excellent study by these Danish authors for more read into this. There is also very high qualitative research on the fact that many of the children who offend have also been crime victims, and that there is quite a large offender-victim overlap. For instance, in the research project Ace Life here in Finland, there is strong research suggesting that ACEs, so that's adverse childhood experiences, increase the relative risk of offender-only, victim-only, and victim-offender statuses. So in a way, this supports the old notion that much of the work to be done to protect or to make society safer, to decrease the risk that children end up in criminality, has to do with supporting family and background factors. It won't go all the way, though. It has to be said that there is still a small portion of children who might end up in very violent, very serious behavior. So we need to have different measures for different children. This also implies that we have to, in the investigative interview, understand this large variation in the children that are being heard as suspects. There is an interesting study by the Fundamental Rights Agency analyzing 9 different countries in Europe on how child suspects are met. And I strongly recommend to have a look at it. It's quite sad reading. These children I would say, do not have their rights upheld in the way they should legally, and certainly also not on a psychosocial level. So it seems we are really in a risk where child suspects may be, for instance, pressured into confessing or not given an opportunity to fully disclose what their situation is. There are also some, but not very many, studies on how police interview child suspects, and they do unfortunately indicate that the quality of these investigative interviews is bad, probably much worse or it seems that it's much worse than for child victims. And again, this highlights the risk that children are coerced when they are heard as suspects. In Finland, we did a study where we analyzed how different ages in the law have been assessed, in the light of child development. And just to keep it very short, child development wasn't really considered, with the exception of a very recent change in the law on sexual crimes. But otherwise, criminal policy does not seem to take child development and the very solid research we have there in consideration, and this is something that really would need to be changed. It is also something that judges, prosecutors, lawyers, police officers need to be aware of. So we would need to have specialization in youth, in child development, and especially with a focus on teenagers when we talk about these suspects, to understand the group that we are dealing with, to make sure that both the investigations, the hearings, the assessments, and the consequences are actually attuned to this particular group, ensuring that they are given all the legal rights that they are entitled to, and also that whatever measures are taken are actually supporting their transition into law-abiding citizens and people who actually can have a brighter future ahead of them, which is, of course, in the benefit of society. As mentioned, there is much more research on child victims and witnesses. In a separate talk, I've gone through the key recommendations made by the European Association of Psychology and Law Researchers. So I'm not going to go into that, but just noting that many of these are exactly the same when we talk about child suspects, but there are some differences. One of them being, for instance, the question of rapport. It's incredibly important to create rapport in all investigative interviewing settings, but we need to make sure that child suspects do not feel pressure to confess because they have such a good rapport with the investigative interviewer. So there is kind of a delicate balance to strike there. And we do not yet have enough research, so we need more research on this. But it's important also when we hear child suspects to understand that they have less developed memory and linguistic skills. They also have increased suggestibility. There is a proneness among pubertal children to act on impulse without consideration for long-term consequences. The decision-making is still undeveloped. So if they think the interview situation is really stressful, they might say, okay, I did it just thinking that, I'll deal with it later. It'll be okay. And maybe it will not, because confessions tend to have a very too much even weight in a process. Many teenage children also appear adults on the outside, and this really can be risky for them because they may be perceived as adults by the criminal justice system. You can have a 15-year-old boy who looks like a man and has a beard and an iPhone and whatever, and is used to taking care of himself, and on the inside this person may still be very, very much in the course of development and unable to understand what is being said and unable to understand how they should manage the situation. Vulnerability due to development seems to be really well recognized when we talk about protection, but not so when we discuss criminal responsibility. And I think it's in the hands of everyone working with these issues to make an active and deliberate attempt to treat all children as children, also when they are suspects of crime. There is some research already, quite a bit of research actually, on why adolescents are more prone to confess to crimes they haven't committed, and I would refer, among other things, to a very nice TED talk by Professor Lindsay Malloy, who has extensive research in these areas. I also would refer to a recent study by Saul Cassin and colleagues. It's on confessions in general, where they recommend to mandate video recording of all suspect interviews, but also adopting a science-based model of investigative interviewing, but in particular to protect youthful suspects and vulnerable adults by mandating the presence of defense attorneys during interrogation. This is another part where there seems to be different approaches or discrepancies, at least in how they are concretized in Europe. There does not seem to be, to my knowledge, countries where you could be certain that an attorney who is supporting the child is actually trained in assisting children of that age group. In the Netherlands, there are more of these, have been more of these this type of recommendation and these changes, but this is something we would need to make sure in all of Europe. The aim of an investigative interview with a child or anyone is not to extract a confession. And again, I would quote the Mendes principles, and for those interested, I would advise to have a look at the Implemendes project and its deliverables and recommendations. It's also not to punish the child or even to make the child understand the consequences of their acts. Sometimes investigative interviewing may be a situation where the child actually, when talking about what has happened, realizes what it has led to. But this is not the primary goal of the investigative interview. It is to collect information. And the child who has been in the situation is the best source to understand whether they were perpetrators, victims, something in between, whether they were actually pressured to do things that they didn't want to do, or whether they were the ones acting because they had some reason in their own mind to do what they did. And this information collection needs to be conducted in a way that is respectful and ensures all the rights of the child, ensures that all the rights of the child are addressed and that the child understands the decisions they take. So in the E-ViVi project, one of the deliverables we've been working with are recommendations for encountering and interviewing child suspects. And these recommendations will be found or are found on the E-ViVi page, both in the HEUNI page and in the Barnahus network's homepage. But in short, it's about how to plan and prepare, introducing the topic, explaining the purpose of the investigative interview, absolute mandatory recording, whether and who should be present other than the child and the interviewer, the rules and responsibility, and how to make sure the child truly understands this, and the importance of collaborating with attorneys to make the children understand this. Also to discuss with the child in a way they understand their status in the process as a suspect, to discuss the presumption of innocence. And then, as said, report, you have to mind a kind of balance. Also, whether and how you should do narrative practice, or kind of a practice interview. For many police officers, it seems counterintuitive that you would talk about something else before going to the actual topic of the interview. However, in many contexts, it works really well. So it has its place, not always, but in many of the investigative interviews. And then the transition to the suspicion has to be very well planned. Interviewers must be mindful to explore the possibility of coercion. So, as said, children may be victims or offenders or both. And this is of huge importance also to understand if there are, for instance, criminal networks who are using children to commit crimes. Because that's of course, where the responsibility more fully lies, and that's the actors that the criminal justice system really want to catch, if you use that word. It's also important to plan how to present contradictory evidence, to what extent you can use the strategies in the strategic use of evidence technique. That's part of a more in-depth training at a later stage. But these all issues are discussed in these recommendations. And then, of course, summarize, clarify, and close. And by that, I'm also closing this lecture and just noting that there are several reports on HEUNI's webpage related to the topic of youth criminality, and also the status of many children between victimhood and offending, like when children are coerced into criminal activities by adult criminal networks. Thank you for your attention.